I was 19 at the time. It was the beginning of summer break, so college was off and I didn't have a job yet. Most of my days were spent inside the house, either playing games, scrolling on my phone, or binge watching shows. That week, my parents had gone out of town to visit some relatives, leaving me alone at home. It wasn't unusual, they traveled often, and I was used to staying alone. Sometimes I'd invite a few friends over, but that night I decided to just relax by myself. I was sitting on the couch watching a comedy series on Netflix, half focused, half scrolling through my phone. It was pretty late, maybe around 11:30 or so, when I suddenly heard a knock at the front door. I paused the TV and looked toward the hallway. At first I didn't think much of it, but then it hit me. It was close to midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? I walked slowly to the door and peeked through the peephole. Two men stood there. Both wore dark jackets and caps, their faces partly hidden in the porch light. They looked calm, but there was something strange about them. They weren't talking, just standing completely still. I hesitated, debating whether to say something or just stay quiet. My gut told me not to make a sound, so I stayed there, watching through the peephole, hoping they'd leave. A few seconds later, one of them spoke. "Hello, we're looking for Mr. and Mrs. Dawson." That was my parents' last name. Though I've changed it here for privacy, my heart started racing. It was far too late for anyone to come asking for them. I didn't answer. After a few moments, the men whispered something to each other and stepped away from the porch. The outside lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, but I didn't hear a car engine, no doors closing, nothing. It was silent. That silence felt heavier than any noise. I went back to the couch but didn't unpause the show. I just sat there, waiting. 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps again. This time, they weren't at the front door. They were moving along the side of the house. My stomach dropped. I ran to the back window and looked out carefully through the blinds. The two men had entered through the side gate into the backyard. I ducked down quickly so they wouldn't see me. Then I heard one of them whisper, followed by the metallic click of the back door handle. They were trying to get in. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and tiptoed into the garage, locking the door behind me. I dialed the police with trembling hands, whispering that someone was breaking into my house. Before I could even finish explaining, a loud crack echoed through the house. The back door had given way. My heart pounded in my ears as I heard them walking inside. Their footsteps moved slowly across the floor, then up the stairs. A door creaked open, then silence. I hid there, barely breathing, counting every second that passed. Those 10 minutes waiting for the police felt endless. Finally, flashing red and blue lights reflected off the walls. The sound of car doors slamming filled the night. As soon as that happened, I heard hurried movement upstairs. The men were panicking, arguing in low voices. Officers burst in through the back door. One of them found me in the garage and quickly led me outside while the others went upstairs. The men didn't fight back when they were caught, but they also didn't say a single word, not about why they were there or what they wanted. Weeks later, the police told us that nothing had been stolen. The only charge they could make stick was breaking and entering, but something about the whole thing felt off. It seemed like they weren't there to rob anyone. They were there looking for my parents, and the scariest part is, I think they planned to wait upstairs until my parents came home. Even now, sometimes I wonder if I had spoken up that night. Maybe they would have left, but deep down, I know they wouldn't have. The way they moved, the way they waited, it felt like they had a plan, and I'm just glad I never opened that door. I live on the outer edge of a small town in northern Colorado. The main reason I chose to live here is because getting a decent piece of land isn't as impossible as it is in most other states. My home is simple, small, quiet, and perfect for living alone. This happened about 5 years ago, back in 2020. It was during spring, and the weather had been terrible for weeks. It seemed like it rained every single day without a break. It was a Sunday evening, and I was finally home after a long week of work. I had decided to spend the night relaxing, watching TV, and listening to the rain hitting the roof. Around 6:30 or maybe 7 p.m., I heard a knock at my front door. At first, I almost didn't catch it because of the sound of rain outside. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't a mail carrier or anyone I'd ever seen before, just some stranger, completely soaked. Having anyone come all the way out to my property without notice was already strange, considering my driveway stretches nearly a mile off the main road. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my hand on the doorknob. The man looked to be in his late 20s. He said he had been camping out in the woods nearby, but got caught in the storm and needed a place to stay for the night. Given how isolated my house was, it wasn't impossible that someone lost in the woods might show up here. My place is the only home within several miles, and the rain really was pouring, enough to make anyone miserable out there. Still, every instinct I had told me not to trust him. I offered to let him use my phone to call for a ride into town, but he declined immediately. "I just need a place to crash till morning," he said. I told him, as politely as I could, that I couldn't help him and he'd have to move on. After a short pause, he nodded, then walked away down the dirt path. I watched him go for a few moments before he veered off into the woods. It was unsettling, but I tried not to overthink it. I shut the door, locked it, and went back to watching TV. Maybe 2 hours later, closer to 9 at night, I noticed something strange. Through the window in my living room, a faint orange glow flickered from the woods behind my house. I walked over and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain, I saw a small campfire burning beneath a large pine tree, and beside it stood a tall figure, motionless, with something long in his hands. The flames glowed just enough to outline his body, but I couldn't tell if he was facing the woods or facing my house. I froze for a moment, staring. Then I quietly shut the curtain and grabbed my phone. I called the police, telling them someone was camping dangerously close to my home. The dispatcher said a unit would be sent out, though it might take a while because of the storm. After hanging up, I looked through the window again. The campfire was still flickering faintly, but the man was gone. Then I heard it. Footsteps, splashing softly through the puddles, coming from the backyard toward the house. I froze for a moment, staring. Then I quietly shut the curtain and grabbed my phone. I called the police, telling them someone was camping dangerously close to my home. The dispatcher said a unit would be sent out, though it might take a while because of the storm. After hanging up, I looked through the window again. The campfire was still flickering faintly, but the man was gone. Then I heard it. Footsteps, splashing softly through the puddles, coming from the backyard toward the house. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the window and peeked out the side one. The same man was walking past, now holding a rifle in one hand. His jacket was drenched and his steps were slow and heavy. He disappeared around the corner toward the front porch. A second later, there was a loud bang against the door. Then another. I ran to the hallway closet, pulled out my self-defense handgun, and crouched behind the wall. My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear the rain anymore. Then came a louder, heavier thud. Wood cracking. He was hitting the door with the butt of his rifle. Another strike, and one of the panels nearly broke loose. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I aimed toward the door frame and fired one shot. The sound exploded through the house, leaving my ears ringing. Then, silence. No footsteps, no voice, nothing but the pounding of the rain. After 5 long minutes, I slowly looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. Only muddy footprints led away from the house, disappearing into the dark field beyond the trees. When the police finally arrived, they did a full search of the property. Near the spot where the campfire had been, they found something half buried, a black duffel bag. Inside were gloves, a rope, duct tape, a flashlight, and a large knife. The officers told me it looked like a burglary or abduction kit that had been buried days earlier and dug up that same night. That means whoever that man was, he had been there before, planning it. To this day, they never found him. No fingerprints, no ID, nothing. Just the bag, the fire, and the footprints that vanished into the woods. I still live in the same house. And every time it rains at night, I can't help but stare through the window, wondering if he's out there again, waiting. I was 21, finishing up my final semester at a small college. I lived with my mom in a weathered bungalow on the edge of a coastal town in Maine. She'd recently taken a late-night lab technician position at the regional hospital, which meant most nights I was alone between about 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. The house creaked and settled like an old ship. I knew every sound well enough that when something didn't fit, I heard it immediately. This happened in the spring of 2016, just a few months before I was set to walk across the graduation stage. Even now, it's one of those nights that replays in slow motion every time the house sighs in the dark. That evening started like any other. Around 7:15 p.m., I kissed my mom on the cheek as she hurried for work, the porch light catching the damp of the evening air. She told me to lock up and called out a quick, "Love you." Once the car's taillights disappeared down the lane, I shut the front door, made a cup of tea, and settled in with a game. It was a school night, so I tried not to stay up too late, but I've never been good at that. By 11:45, my eyes were heavy. I turned everything off and went upstairs, but phones have a way of keeping you awake even when you're tired. I scrolled. I watched a few short clips, and somewhere close to 1 a.m., sleep finally took me. I woke to a sound so ordinary it almost felt comforting at first, the soft slam of a door downstairs. I glanced at the clock, 3:18 a.m., and for half a second, relief washed over me. Maybe she'd returned early. My muscles relaxed. I pulled the blanket up and listened. That relief didn't last. Footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate. Not the quick, exhausted shuffle of someone coming home from a late shift, but a measured pace, like someone mapping the place with their feet. At first I told myself it was my imagination, that my brain was catching at stray sounds. Then the steps continued. Living room, hallway, kitchen, and somewhere inside me, a cold knot formed. My mom never walked through each room like that. She liked straight lines, quick motions, a hurried path from car to shower. This sound was methodical. It was patient. I flicked on the bedside lamp. Nothing. The sound stopped the instant the room lit up. I held my breath, listening for any slip of sound below. Silence, thick and unnatural. Careful not to creak, I pushed my door open and eased toward the top of the stairs. The hallway was dark, the only light a pale wedge from the street lamp outside. I crouched at the railing and peered into the living room. Everything looked ordinary at first glance. The couch cushions were in place, the coffee table had its usual clutter, the console's standby light blinked faintly. Those small details, the things a burglar would take first, were untouched. Something about that made my stomach turn colder. If someone had planned to rob us, they would have gone for the expensive items, but nothing was missing. I whispered, "Mom?" The house answered with nothing. I crept down step by step. Each board under my foot seemed to scream. At the bottom, the air felt denser, cooler. Near the kitchen tile, my eyes caught a smear of mud, a fresh footprint edged with soil. The print led toward the dining area where, under the dark shadow, a figure sat. He was bundled in black, head down, hands tucked into gloves. A scarf or mask hid his face. At first he seemed like a void in the chair, absence given shape. Then he looked up and his eyes, or where his eyes should be, locked onto me. No movement, no breath I could see. He was terrifyingly still. I ran, up the stairs, into my room, the door slamming shut behind me. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial. I called 911, voice a cracked whisper. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my house, I said. He's downstairs. Please, come quick. My words tumbled out. The operator's calm questions and instructions felt like the only tether I had to the world. Stay where you are. Don't make any noise. Officers are on their way, the operator said. I hugged the phone to my chest and pressed my back to the door. The house hummed with the sound of rain on the roof, and my pulse tried to drum out a message in my ears. I could hear footsteps again, that same slow, measured approach, now crossing the hall and moving toward the base of the stairs. I whispered to the operator, "He's at the stairs." "Stay quiet," she said. "Help is coming." For minutes, that stretched into a kind of suspended time. I heard nothing but the rain and my own breathing. Then, as if some script flipped, the front door opened. Rain sluiced in a wet, metallic sound. He was leaving. I waited until I heard the unmistakable rumble of a car engine and headlights slicing across the curtains. I raced down into the yard, the porch slick under my sneakers, and there she was, my mom, splattered with rain, looking bewildered. I nearly toppled into her arms. Between ragged breaths I told her everything, the footsteps, the print, the man at the table. My words poured out faster than she could process. Police arrived within minutes, flashes reflecting off wet gutters. They combed the house, checked every closet, every cupboard, even the crawl space under the house. They found no forced entry, no fingerprints, no stolen goods, only that single muddy footprint on my kitchen tile and the chair where the man had sat. The officers conferred in low voices. One officer knelt and photographed the print. Another walked through the yard, flashlight beam cutting across the soaked garden. Later, an officer pulled me aside and said something that has settled into my bones ever since. He wasn't interested in taking things. He was waiting for someone. The timing, he broke in minutes before your mom's usual arrival. That sentence carved out a space in my chest I still feel. Whoever that man was, he'd studied our routines. He'd chosen that night because he knew when my mom would come home. The implication was ugly and simple. He was there for her. They never found him. No leads connected. No CCTV from nearby houses showed his face. No one recognized the jacket. No prints matched anything in the system. The duress of uncertainty was worse than any evidence could have been. The idea that he might decide to return, or that someone else with similar intent might learn and try again. Years have passed, but habits don't leave easily. I double-check locks more than I used to. I stand by the window when someone's car pulls into the driveway, counting the beats it takes from the curb to the porch. The house still creaks the same way, but now each creak asks a question. When I tell people the story, they ask how I feel about it now. Mostly, the answer is a slow, heavy gratitude and a stubborn residue of fear. Grateful because I woke up, because I went downstairs. Fearful because timing is a small, sharp thing, and it almost didn't go my way. I still sometimes imagine the worst, and then I flip the script in my head. What if I hadn't woken up? What if my mom had come in earlier? The gap between 2 minutes and 1 minute feels enormous when you imagine the what if. So I lock the doors a little sooner. I sleep with a lamp on more nights than not. And when the rain hits the roof, I listen, because one night of attention might be the thin strand that separates ordinary life from something far darker. But every time I pass that kitchen tile, I look down at the spot where the footprint once was and feel the echo of that night, like a stone dropped into deep water. The ripples are still moving. I'm 35 and I live alone in a small remote cabin tucked away in the countryside. The nearest neighbors are over half a mile away and I only see them occasionally. Most of the time, I keep to myself, venturing into the small town only when necessary for supplies. I'm semi-retired, which means most of my days are quiet, spent reading, tinkering with tools, or doing small projects around the property. A few months each year, I take on occasional contracting jobs to keep busy. But right now, my focus is entirely on home and yard maintenance. It was late autumn, the trees stripped of their leaves, and the air carried a bitter chill, hinting at the winter to come. That afternoon, I decided to gather all of my outdoor equipment, lawnmowers, rakes, shovels, and other tools, and store them in the shed for the cold months ahead. Everything had been left out over the summer and early fall, so it was a tedious but necessary job. The yard was quiet, except for the faint rustling of dry leaves in the wind. I had just lifted the last box into the shed when something unusual caught my attention. A man was walking along the narrow country road that connected to my driveway. He carried nothing, not a bag, not camping equipment, not even a coat to protect against the cold. The road was empty except for a few scattered houses, like mine. The nearest town was a solid 4-hour walk away. I watched him carefully, trying to determine if he was lost or if there was some other reason for his presence. He kept moving steadily, and as he vanished in the distance, I scanned the road in both directions. Not a single car passed by, not a single sound broke the eerie stillness. My stomach twisted at the oddity, but after a few moments, I shook my head and returned to finishing the yard work. By the time I stepped inside, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. I prepared a simple dinner and sat down, trying to push the uneasy feeling from my mind. But then, a sudden, solid thump from outside made me jump. The sound was unmistakably wooden, echoing from the direction of the shed. I froze, staring out the window. The shed door was wide open. It was old, yes, but the door had never unlatched itself before. My heart started racing. I knew I had to check it, if only to make sure it was secure. I grabbed my rifle, not because I expected anything dangerous, but because instinct told me to be ready. The night was silent, except for the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant cry of an owl. I stepped out into the yard, moving slowly, listening intently. The field surrounding the house was empty. No wildlife, no signs of anyone. The eerie stillness pressed down on me, making every shadow seem alive. When I reached the shed, I turned on my flashlight and shined it inside. At first glance, everything appeared normal. I stepped carefully into the shed, examining every corner for any sign of movement or disturbance. But there was nothing. Nothing out of place, nothing hiding. I closed the shed door and secured it, taking a deep breath before turning back toward the house. Halfway across the field, the sense of unease grew. A gnawing feeling of dread crept up my spine, making my skin prickle. I couldn't explain it, but my instinct screamed that something was wrong. By the time I reached the front door, I was tense, almost frozen. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and flicked on the lights. That's when I saw it. A muddy shoe print on the floor. Following the trail, I realized the prints led straight to the spare bedroom. My heart began to pound. I raised my rifle and took a slow, steadying breath. I moved carefully down the hallway, pressing my ear against the door. I could hear someone breathing, heavy, deliberate, and close. I froze, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, the handle began to twist in my hand. The door creaked open. I jumped back, holding the rifle ready. A man stood there, holding a massive metal shovel as if it were a weapon. His eyes were wide, filled with pure rage. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, perhaps startled by my gun, but the intensity of his anger was undeniable. I shouted at him to stop, trying to sound commanding, but fear had me frozen in place. He didn't advance, but his furious expression never wavered. I knew the police wouldn't arrive for at least an hour, and I couldn't hold him at gunpoint indefinitely without risking everything. Suddenly, he flung the shovel toward me and darted back into the room. My instincts took over, and I chased him inside, only to see him crawling out the window. Part of me wanted to stop him, but another part was paralyzed, unable to move. He jumped out into the field and disappeared into the night, vanishing into the darkness without a trace. Even now, years later, that man's identity remains a mystery. His intentions were never revealed, and I've never seen him again. If I hadn't been armed, or if he had caught me off guard, I might not be here today. That night left a permanent mark on me, a reminder that even in the quietest, most isolated places, danger can strike without warning. Every creak of the floor, every shadow at night reminds me of that man, and the fear that I barely survived. I don't usually travel far from home. Most of my trips are short visits to friends or family, so this was one of those rare occasions where I had to stay somewhere completely unfamiliar. The town I needed to visit was small, tucked away in a remote mountain valley, and the few hotels there didn't look very appealing. They seemed old, worn out, and frankly, a little depressing. Scrolling online, I stumbled across a small cottage listed on a website like Airbnb. It was my first time using it, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but the house looked promising. Cozy, tidy, and far more inviting than any motel I had seen. The pictures showed a porch with a hanging lantern, a neat garden, and a warm glow from the windows. I submitted a booking request, and within minutes, it was confirmed. I started the long drive a week later, 12 hours on the road, twisting through mountains and narrow highways. I had hoped to arrive before nightfall, but delays and a wrong turn slowed me down. By the time I reached the town, it was well past midnight. The streets were completely empty. Not a single light flickered in shop windows. All the small stores, cafes, and even the gas stations were closed. Every house I passed was dark, and the silence felt heavy, almost unnatural. The wind rustled through the pine trees, making soft, eerie sounds that echoed off the nearby buildings. My car's tires crunched over gravel as I followed the navigation through a narrow forest-lined road. Finally, I reached the cottage. Its porch light was on, and a faint glow came from an upstairs window. I told myself it was probably the last guest who had forgotten to turn it off. I parked my car and grabbed my luggage, heart still racing slightly from the drive and the town's unsettling quiet. I entered the house using the key code from my email and locked the door behind me. The air smelled faintly of cleaning products and polished wood. Everything was neatly arranged, almost staged, as if no one had lived there for weeks. I set my bags down in a corner and went upstairs to turn off the light. The room it came from was a small guest bedroom with only a bed and a dresser. I flicked a switch and turned to head back. The main bedroom was larger, with a small dresser, a nightstand, and a window overlooking the dark street. I unpacked a few essentials, brushed my teeth, and prepared for bed. I had reserved the cottage for 2 nights, though I only planned to stay one. Lying down, I tried to relax, but the silence of the house was almost too complete. Even the walls seemed to absorb sound. Occasionally, a faint creak would echo from the ceiling or the floorboards. I told myself it was normal. Old houses creak in the night, but it didn't make it feel any safer. After about an hour, I finally tried to sleep. That's when I heard it, a dull, heavy thud coming from somewhere in the house. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Another thud followed, then a soft scraping sound. I sat up immediately. Maybe it was a branch against the window, or maybe an animal. My mind tried to rationalize it, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Slowly, I got up and tiptoed toward the door. I peeked into the dark hallway. Nothing. Silence. Then a soft creak from the floorboards across the hall. It was deliberate, slow. Someone or something was moving toward my room. Panic surged through me. My body froze. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. This was no random sound. Someone was here. I pressed my hand against the door handle, pushing down with all my strength. The handle moved. Someone was trying to open the door. I pressed harder, holding my breath. Then a slam. The door rattled violently. I leaned my shoulder against it, straining to keep it shut. Through the narrow gap, I caught a glimpse of a man's face, eyes wide, burning with fury. He yanked at the door again. I shoved back with all my weight and twisted the lock into place. He cursed harsh words I couldn't make out and slammed one last time. Then, without warning, he ran downstairs. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained everything. The operator's calm voice was a small comfort. I could hear their instructions, reassuring me that help was on the way. Within minutes, lights appeared outside. The small-town police arrived, quiet but efficient. They checked the house, reassured me that I was safe, and made note of the attempted break-in. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening for any sounds, afraid to even breathe too loudly. When morning came, I quickly packed my things and left. I never found out who the man was or why he had tried to break in, but the memory of those eyes haunts me. That kind of rage, that obsession. It felt personal, as if I had done something to provoke him, though I hadn't. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling. The memory of his face, the way he slammed against the door, it lingers. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine him standing in the shadows just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I haven't stayed in any Airbnb-like places since. The thought of being alone in a stranger's home is unbearable, and honestly, I don't think I ever will again. Every time I see a listing online, I remember that night. I remember the silence, the creaks, the footsteps growing closer. I remember the cold, impossible fear of feeling completely trapped. And I shiver. That night taught me something I never wanted to learn. Sometimes danger isn't obvious. Sometimes it waits quietly in the dark, behind a door you think is locked. And sometimes it comes for you anyway. This happened about 4 years ago, during a sweltering summer break. I had decided to visit my cousin in a city several hours away. He lives about 7 hours from my home, and I rarely get to see him. His studio apartment was too small for me to stay in, so I booked a cozy rental cabin just a few blocks away. The place was cheap, comparable to a budget hotel, and seemed perfect. I arrived early in the morning, carrying a small suitcase and a backpack. The streets were quiet, the sunlight reflecting off the pavement, making everything feel unusually bright. After dropping off my luggage, I walked to a nearby cafe, grabbed breakfast, and met my cousin for lunch. We reminisced about childhood, laughed at old stories, and planned the evening ahead. After lunch, I went shopping for groceries, mainly snacks, water, and a few simple meals for my stay. I returned to the cabin around 6 p.m., feeling content but exhausted. The cabin was modest: a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a couch and TV. The walls were pale yellow, the floorboards creaked faintly with every step, and there was a faint smell of damp wood. It wasn't luxurious, but I reminded myself I was here to relax, not to indulge. By 9:30 p.m., I decided to sleep. I lay down, letting the mattress cradle me, but my mind was still racing. I kept replaying the day in my head, conversations with my cousin, the sights I'd seen, minor details of the cabin that felt slightly off. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into sleep. Hours later, I awoke abruptly. The room was completely dark, thicker than usual, like the darkness itself had weight. My first thought was that it was just a nightmare, but then I heard it, footsteps outside my bedroom, slow, deliberate, each step echoing in the hallway. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Then came a soft click of a door shutting. Silence followed, but it was heavier than before, almost suffocating. I lay still on the bed, afraid to move, afraid that even breathing might alert someone to my presence. After a long, tense minute, I forced myself to get up. Peeking into the hallway, I saw the front door slightly ajar, the same door I had heard close. My mind raced. Was the intruder still inside, or had he already left? I moved cautiously from room to room. Nothing, no one, no disturbed furniture, no missing items, except that the front door was unlocked. My hands shook as I double-checked the locks, then I called the police. They arrived quickly, but were frustratingly unhelpful. They advised me to lock all doors and contact the property owner. That was it. No inspection, no reassurance. I stayed awake until sunrise, anxiety gnawing at me like a persistent shadow. The next morning, I spoke with the cabin owner. He changed the keypad code, which provided a small sense of security. I went out with my cousin again, had dinner and drinks, and returned to the cabin around 9 p.m. Sitting on the couch, my exhaustion battled with anxiety. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those footsteps again in my mind. Sleep felt impossible. My rational side told me it was over, but the fear lingered, crawling under my skin. Finally, I decided to check the cabin once more, hoping to calm my mind. I moved deliberately through each room, the living room, kitchen, then down the hallway to the bedroom. I opened the closet, inspected the bathroom, even checked under the bed. Just as I turned to leave, I heard heavy, rapid footsteps racing toward the bedroom. My stomach dropped. I spun around and caught a glimpse of a tall, shadowy figure slamming the bedroom door behind him. The footsteps echoed through the cabin, moving quickly from room to room, living room, kitchen, then toward the front door. I stayed frozen, listening to every sound. Then came the soft but definite click of the front door closing. I called the police again. This time, the owner arrived as well. What I saw when they opened the door made my stomach turn. The living room was in chaos. Furniture overturned, cabinets open, drawers emptied, dishes scattered across the floor. Yet strangely, nothing appeared stolen. It seemed as if he had been searching for something specific, something only he knew about. I didn't stay another night. I checked into a hotel, uneasy but safer. Days passed without updates, no suspect, no answers. Even now, I can't shake the memory. My mind keeps circling back to questions. If I had already checked the cabin thoroughly, where was he hiding? How long had he been inside? Had he been watching me the entire time? And the most terrifying thought, what would have happened if I had fallen asleep on that couch? Even simple things, creaking floors, sudden shadows, a gust of wind, bring me back to that night. That night changed how I see quiet houses, and I still wonder, was that intruder real? Or had I just glimpsed the darkest corners of my own mind? And the scariest part, even after all these years, I feel that uneasy presence sometimes, as if the intruder never truly left. I was 25 at the time, living alone in a tiny one-bedroom rental house on the far edge of town. It wasn't fancy, the kind of place with old creaky floors, yellowed walls, and that faint musty smell that never really goes away. But the rent was cheap, and for someone working a low-paying job and trying to get by, it felt like enough. It had been raining non-stop that week. the kind of heavy rain that made the air thick and the streets glisten like mirrors at night. That Friday, after getting home from work, all I wanted to do was relax. I ordered some takeout, took a long shower, and hopped online to play games with my friends. It was the perfect night to stay in. Thunder rumbling outside, the steady patter of rain on the windows, no work the next day. I remember feeling cozy, safe, and completely shut off from the rest of the world. We'd been playing for about 2 hours when I heard it, a single heavy thump. I paused my game and pulled off my headset, just sitting there for a few seconds. The sound had come from upstairs, but it wasn't sharp, more like something heavy falling or maybe hitting a wall. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling or maybe something outside, but curiosity got the better of me. I muted the game and went to check. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed. The upstairs was small, just a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. But when I looked around, everything was normal. No leaks, no fallen objects, no signs of anything unusual. I stood there for a while, listening. All I could hear was the rain tapping on the roof. So I went back downstairs, shrugged it off, and got back online with my friends. We played until everyone started logging off around 2 a.m. I wasn't sleepy yet, so I decided to grab some snacks and watch YouTube for a bit before bed. I was sitting on the couch, phone in one hand, chips in the other, when I heard it again. Thump. This time it sounded softer, but still came from above me. I froze. My TV was off. My computer was off. Everything in the house was silent except the rain. I waited, half expecting it to repeat, but it didn't. I climbed the stairs again, slower this time, checked the bedroom, checked the bathroom. Nothing. I even opened the closet, looked behind the dresser. Nothing. It didn't sound like thunder either. Thunder rolled, but this sound, it hit the walls. It felt like it came from inside the house. After about 10 minutes of searching, I gave up and decided maybe I was overthinking it, but that sound had left me uneasy, that prickly feeling you get when your instincts whisper that something isn't right. So I put on my hoodie, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside into the rain. Maybe something outside was banging against the wall. The rain hit my face cold and sharp as I circled the house, my shoes splashing in the puddles forming on the grass. That's when I noticed it. A large tree just a few feet from the side of the house. Its thick branches reached dangerously close to the siding, swaying slightly in the wind. But even with the storm, it wasn't moving enough to hit the wall. Still, something about it caught my attention. Behind those branches, half hidden, was a small window. A window I had never noticed before. It was positioned higher than my bedroom window, and there were no other rooms up there. That's when I realized the house must have an attic, but I'd never seen a hatch, a door, anything that led up there. My landlord had never mentioned it either. I remember standing there, drenched in the rain, staring at that hidden window and feeling my stomach drop. I went back inside, dripping wet, and started searching. I checked the hallway, the ceiling above the bathroom, the kitchen, nothing. Then, in my bedroom closet, I saw it. At the very top, perfectly flush with the ceiling, was a small square outline. It blended so well with the paint that I would have never noticed it if I wasn't specifically looking for it. I dragged over a box to stand on, reached up and pressed against it. It didn't move at first, but after a firm pull, it cracked open with a sharp snap. A wave of stale, rotting air spilled out. I gagged at the smell, like old meat and mold. Then a rusty foldable ladder slid down with a metallic groan. The sound echoed through the house. I hesitated, just staring into the black square above me, every instinct telling me not to go up. Then, another thump. It came from right above me this time. I nearly dropped the ladder. The smell grew stronger the closer I got to the opening. From where I stood, I could tell the attic wasn't tall, maybe 2 feet high at most. A crawl space, not a real room. I raised my flashlight, shining it into the narrow darkness. The beam caught dust swirling in the air like smoke. My breath hitched as I scanned the small space. For a moment I saw nothing, just insulation, wooden beams and shadows. And then I saw movement. At the far end of the attic, near the covered window, something shifted. I focused my light and froze. A man. He was crouched on all fours, his face half lit, eyes wide open, staring directly at me. His skin was pale and greasy, his clothes torn and filthy. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he tilted his head slowly, and I realized his lips were moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. I stumbled backward, my foot slipping off the box. I fell hard, barely catching myself on the floor as I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the room. Behind me, I could hear him shifting, dragging himself backward into the dark. I ran outside barefoot into the rain, shaking as I called 911. My voice was barely steady enough to explain what happened. The police arrived 10 minutes later. I stayed in the driveway, soaked and trembling, as they entered the house with flashlights drawn. For several minutes, all I could hear was the rain and the occasional shout from inside. Then, one of the officers called out that they'd found him. Turns out, he was a homeless man who'd been climbing up the tree to get into that attic window. He'd been living up there for at least a week, quietly, above my ceiling, watching me come and go. They found old food wrappers, a blanket, and even a small light he'd stolen from somewhere. When they brought him out, he didn't say a word. He just kept staring at me, with those same wide eyes, a mix of anger and fear, like I'd invaded his space. I moved out 2 days later. I didn't even go back inside to pack everything. The landlord handled it. It's been years since then, and every house I've lived in since, the first thing I do, before I check the water pressure, before I even test the lights, is look for an attic. Because no matter how secure you think you are, you never really know who might be above you, watching. For the past few years, my life has been on a loop. I work 2 different jobs, one early in the morning and another in the evening. Most days, I leave home before sunrise, around 5:30, and I don't return until nearly 11 at night. My apartment's small, a single-floor unit at the end of a quiet street. I barely have time for myself. I come home, shower, eat whatever I can find, and then pass out on my bed until my alarm drags me up again the next morning. That routine had gone on for months without a problem. But a few months ago, something happened that completely changed the way I feel about living alone. That night, everything started like usual. I came home exhausted, dropped my bag by the couch, and went straight to the bathroom. I'd been sweating all day, so I was looking forward to that hot shower, but while I was rinsing my hair, I heard something. It was faint, like the floorboards just outside the bathroom door were shifting. At first I ignored it. Old apartments make noise all the time. Creaks, ticks, the usual stuff. But then I heard it again, this time a slow, dragging step. I turned off the water, holding my breath. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, another creak. I quickly wrapped myself in a towel and opened the door. The hallway light flickered as I stepped out, and my stomach dropped when I saw my bedroom door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd left it open wider before I went to shower. Still, I didn't see anyone, and after checking around, I convinced myself it was probably just the air or the floor settling. I went to bed, but that night I could barely sleep. The apartment felt alive. Every little sound felt sharper, closer. At one point, I thought I heard someone whisper my name, but when I sat up, the room was empty. I told myself it was just exhaustion. The next morning, I left for work half asleep. When I got home that evening, I noticed something strange. The window in my kitchen, which I never open, was slightly cracked. My first thought was that I must have done it accidentally, but a cold shiver ran through me when I realized the lock was still in the closed position. I brushed it off, trying to focus on my routine. I heated up some leftover food, scrolled through my phone, and got ready for bed. When I turned the shower on again, I caught something faint behind the noise of the water. Footsteps, slow, careful, and heavy. This time, it wasn't just outside the bathroom door. It sounded like it was moving from the hallway to the living room. My heart started pounding so hard it made my vision blur. I waited, trying to listen through the rush of water. Then, silence. I turned off the shower, grabbed a towel, and crept to the door. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I opened it slowly, half expecting someone to be standing there. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the streetlight through the curtains. But when I stepped into the living room, I swear I felt a sudden draft of cold air, like someone had just moved past me. That night, I barely slept again. Every sound made me flinch. The fridge hum, the pipes, the ticking of the wall clock. They all felt off somehow, like there was a rhythm to it, a pattern. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard a loud creak from the hallway, then the faint sound of breathing. I sat up instantly, staring at the door. The air felt thick, and that's when I saw it, the shadow of 2 feet beneath the door. They didn't move, just stood there. I froze, my throat was dry. After what felt like forever, the shadow shifted, then slowly walked away. I couldn't move for minutes. When I finally did, I turned on every single light in the apartment and searched every corner, under the bed, the closet, behind the couch. Nothing. I was losing my mind from lack of sleep, but I still had to work the next day. The exhaustion made me dizzy all day long. My boss even asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was fine. When I got home that night, I noticed muddy footprints near the front door. Not mine. I froze, staring at them. They led toward the kitchen, but when I followed them, they just stopped. I called my friend Alex, who lives nearby, and told him I thought someone might have broken in. He came over with a flashlight and a baseball bat. We searched every room again, attic, basement, closets, everything. Still nothing. He joked that I was paranoid, but I could tell even he looked uneasy by how quiet the place felt. That night, I double-checked every window and door lock before going to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a soft thud, then another. It sounded like it came from inside my room. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, and I realized I could see a faint outline. The corner of my closet door was open, just slightly. I stared at it for nearly a minute before reaching for my phone to turn on the flashlight. The second the light hit the door, I heard something scuttle inside. I leapt out of bed, opened the door, nothing but clothes and boxes. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I pushed everything aside, looking for any space big enough for someone to fit. That's when I saw it, a hole behind an old dresser. It was small, but it led into the wall, some sort of crawl space. I called the police that night. When they came, they found evidence that someone had been staying there. A blanket, a half-eaten bag of chips, and empty water bottles. Whoever it was had been hiding inside my walls. The officer said it looked like the person had come and gone through an old maintenance hatch that connected to the basement. They couldn't find him though. He was long gone. For days after that, I couldn't sleep. Every creak made me think he was still there, still watching. I moved out a month later, but sometimes when I'm alone, I still think about those nights. The shadow under the door, the breathing, the footsteps that always stopped just before I opened my eyes. I still wonder how many nights he'd been there before I ever noticed, and what he might have done if I hadn't woken up when I did. It was early last year when I finally decided to leave the city. I had landed a remote job, which meant I could work from anywhere. The thought of staying in my cramped city apartment, surrounded by endless noise and crowded streets, suddenly seemed unbearable. I found a small, modest house about an hour and a half outside the city. It was tucked away in a quiet area, surrounded by dense trees, with a long driveway leading up to it. There were no immediate neighbors close enough to bother me, and that sense of isolation felt perfect. The first few months were wonderful. Mornings were quiet, filled only with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The nights were calm, the air fresh, and I felt free in a way I hadn't felt in years. I would often sit on the porch, enjoying the sunset, feeling as though the rest of the world had simply disappeared. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. Then, one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. A knock echoed through the house. Sharp, deliberate. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't had a single visitor since moving in. Not a single person had come to my door. For a moment, I thought it might be a delivery, or perhaps someone from the nearby road. Hesitantly, I walked to the door and opened it. A tall man stood there, maybe in his mid-40s. He didn't greet me, didn't smile. Instead, he leaned slightly to the side, his eyes scanning past me into the house, as though he was checking to see who else was inside. A shiver ran down my spine. I instinctively stepped in front of the door, blocking his view. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing a calm tone, even though my voice trembled slightly. He didn't answer. He just continued to stare for several seconds. Then, without a word, he turned and walked slowly down the driveway. I watched him go, heart pounding, until he reached the street, got into a silver sedan parked there, and drove off. The unease lingered long after he left. That night, I double-checked every door and window, making sure all were locked. I thought about calling the police, but hesitated. After all, he hadn't actually done anything, yet. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak in the floorboards louder. Around 9 p.m., I sat on the couch, trying to calm my nerves by turning on the TV, but then I heard it. Voices, low, muffled, coming from the backyard. My stomach dropped. I muted the television and strained to listen. There were definitely two people, whispering, moving carefully, deliberately. I crept to the back window and peered through the blinds. In the dim light, I could see two figures moving between the trees. One of them carried something long, maybe a tool, maybe a weapon, while the other stayed slightly behind, careful to stay out of view. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it. They moved slowly, almost methodically, until they reached the side of the house. I dashed from window to window, trying to follow them, but the whispers stopped, and they vanished from sight. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Should I hide? Before I could decide, a loud knock at the front door made me jump, sending chills down my spine. I crept toward the door and looked through the peephole. A man in dark clothing and a cap that shadowed his face was standing there. It had to be one of the figures from outside, but where was the other? "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. Instead, he glanced toward the side of the house, then back at the door. Seconds dragged on endlessly. My stomach tightened, and fear took over completely. Suddenly, a deafening crash came from the back of the house, the sound of heavy metal against wood. I ran to the hallway and saw someone striking the back door with a shovel. He looked up at me for a fraction of a second, then disappeared into the shadows. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Another crash, this time at the side window, made my blood run cold. I tried to describe what was happening to the dispatcher, my voice barely coherent. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. The police arrived minutes later, their sirens cutting through the night. They detained the man from the front door, the same man who had visited earlier that day, but even under questioning, he refused to reveal who the second man was or why he had come back. He denied everything, despite the obvious damage to doors and windows. Weeks later, he had still refused to provide any explanation. The memory of that night haunts me even now. Every shadow, every unexpected sound makes my heart race. I still wonder why they came, what they had planned, and whether they would have returned if I hadn't called the police. I moved away shortly after, but the fear never truly left. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that man, standing silently at my doorway, watching, waiting. Who was he? Who was the other man? And what would have happened if I hadn't been home to witness it? When I was 22, I made a really bad decision. I moved out of my parents' house long before I was financially ready. I'd been planning it for months, scrolling through endless listings of cheap apartments, searching for roommates, and trying to find any way possible to make it work. For some reason, I became obsessed with the idea of having my own place, even if it meant living on a tight budget. After a long search, I came across a post on a rental site about a spare room for rent, not too far from where I worked. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, and the guy who owned it was looking for someone to rent out the other room. I messaged him right away and got a response within minutes. He asked me a few questions about myself, then sent over a document that was basically a list of house rules. It was all normal stuff. Keep the place clean, pay rent on time, no loud music. After agreeing to everything, he invited me to come check the place out that same evening. When I arrived, I was actually impressed by how neat and cozy the apartment looked. It was spotless, almost too perfect. Everything seemed like it had been arranged for a magazine photo. The owner, whose name was Lucas, was a bit strange though. He looked like he was around his late 20s, but his vibe didn't really match the tidy apartment. He was wearing an old hoodie and seemed nervous, constantly fidgeting when he spoke. Still, I was too focused on finally moving out to care. A week later, I rented a small truck, packed up my stuff, and moved into the apartment. But when I stepped inside, I froze. The place looked completely different. All the decorations and furniture were gone, except for a single torn couch in the living room. It felt like I'd walked into a completely different place. Lucas acted like nothing had changed. He was overly cheerful, talking non-stop about how great it would be to have a roommate. When I asked what happened to all the furniture, he just smiled and brushed off my question, saying something about doing some redecorating. I felt uneasy, but I'd already paid and I didn't want to move back home, so I stayed. For the first few weeks, things were fine. Actually, I hardly saw Lucas at all. He said he worked long shifts, usually getting home really late. But after about a month, I noticed he'd basically stopped coming home altogether. Maybe once a week, I'd hear the door open at 2 or 3 in the morning. He'd walk around downstairs for a while and then he'd leave again without saying a word. At first I didn't mind. I liked having the apartment to myself. But after a while, I started getting curious. Why would someone beg for a roommate and then barely be home? Then one night, around 2 a.m., after weeks of not seeing him, I was jolted awake by someone pounding on my bedroom door and yelling my name. I jumped up, half asleep, and opened the door. Lucas was standing there, drenched in sweat, his face twisted with anger. "Do not come out of your room," he said sharply. Before I could reply, he slammed the door shut, nearly catching my fingers. I stood there, frozen, listening to his footsteps go down the hall. Then I heard something heavy being dragged across the floor. A long scraping sound, followed by the creak of the garage door. My heart was racing. I quietly opened my door and stepped out. There was a trail of mud smeared across the hallway floor, leading to the garage. I tried opening the door, but it was locked from the inside. That's when I knew something was very wrong. I grabbed my keys and ran straight to my car. As I drove off, I called the police and told them everything. When they arrived, Lucas was gone, and the place looked spotless again. No mud, no smears, nothing out of place. After a few days of investigation, they found out that Lucas didn't actually own the apartment. He'd been renting it under a fake name, and the lease documents he'd sent me were completely forged. Apparently, he'd done this before, renting places short-term under aliases, then disappearing. They never caught him. Nobody even knows his real name. To this day, I have no idea what he was doing in that garage that night, or what he didn't want me to see. But I can't stop wondering why he was so desperate to have me live there in the first place. Whatever his plan was, I'm just glad I left when I did, because if I hadn't, I'm not sure I'd still be here to tell the story. About 4 years ago, I moved from the Midwest to a quiet town down south for a new job. Because of a tight budget and work schedule, I couldn't visit the place before moving in. It wasn't a huge risk. I was only renting, but I still felt uneasy about committing sight unseen. It was early October when the moving company arrived to pack everything up and deliver it to the new house. The landlord was kind enough to let them in ahead of time to unload everything, since I wouldn't be moving in for several more days. The house was modest, single story, with a layout that felt a little strange. The kitchen and living room were on one side, and a long hallway led to the bedrooms and bathrooms on the other. When I finally got there on a Thursday evening, the place was a mess. Boxes were piled high in every room, and furniture was scattered across the floor. The walls were plain, and the floors creaked under my steps, giving the place a strangely empty feeling. Despite the chaos, the house itself seemed fine, just a little isolated, and the long hallway made it feel bigger than it actually was. By the time I finished setting up the bed in the master bedroom, it was already late. I turned off the lights, but without a clock yet, I had no idea what time it was. I slipped under the covers, expecting a quiet night, but that expectation quickly faded. In the middle of the night, I woke to a strange, soft noise. At first I thought it might be the house settling, or perhaps the wind brushing against the walls. Still, I couldn't ignore it. Curious, I got out of bed and moved toward the bedroom door. The closer I got, the more I realized the sound was coming from somewhere down the hallway. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to open the door. The noise stopped immediately. The hallway was dark and empty, and I flicked on the light. Nothing. I slowly walked down, scanning the living room. The place looked exactly the same as it had when I first arrived, but instinct made me turn on every light, double-checking the corners. On the floor, among the cluttered boxes, were footprints, clear, dusty footprints. I assumed they were from the movers, but a small part of me felt uneasy. The footprints seemed oddly deliberate, like someone had been moving carefully, then abruptly stopped. I went back to the bedroom, trying to calm myself. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the sound that had stopped the moment I opened the door. I thought through every possible explanation, the pipes, the settling wood, the wind, but none of them matched what I had heard. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. It wasn't long before I woke again. This time, it was a heavy thud, followed by quick, heavy footsteps running down the hallway. My eyes shot open. I turned toward the bedroom door, which was now wide open, and froze. The footprints on the floor led straight to my bed. My heart raced as I realized someone had been inside, right there in my room, standing near me. I leapt out of bed and ran toward the door, but they were gone. The only evidence left behind were the scuffed prints showing they had sprinted away. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone, locking myself in the bathroom until the police arrived. When they did, they found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or locks, nothing, just the footprints. I tried convincing myself it was someone who had gained access before I moved in, but that didn't explain why they had come all the way to my bed, or why I had heard the thud and footsteps in real time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly missed something much worse. Over the next few days, I carefully unpacked every box. Nothing was missing. The house seemed completely ordinary in the daylight, but I could feel the tension of that night lingering, as if the walls themselves remembered. Every creak in the hallway, every shadow in the corner of a room made my stomach tighten. The landlord later approached me, offering to let me break the lease early if I agreed not to say anything about what had happened. At the time, I assumed he just didn't want to scare potential renters and lose income. But now, thinking back, I wonder if there was more to his insistence, something he didn't want me to notice about the house. Even today, I can't forget the sensation of those footsteps, the instant silence the moment I opened my door, and the sight of footprints leading straight to my bed. No matter how rational I try to be, there's a part of me that knows I was not entirely alone that night, and I can't help but wonder, if they ever return, will I be ready next time? This happened about 3 years ago when I was 28. My father had recently passed away, and as his only child, the old family house was left to me. At that time, I was living in a small run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city because it was all I could afford. I spent weeks thinking about what to do. Selling the house was an option, but it felt wrong, almost like abandoning something that had been part of my family for generations. After much deliberation, I decided to move in. The house was fully paid off, so it would give me a chance to save money, stabilize my life, and eventually sell it to buy a place that truly felt like mine. When my lease ended, I packed up everything I owned and moved across town. The house sat on a large piece of land that had once been part of a farming community. Over the years, however, most of the farms had been abandoned. The fields surrounding the house were wild, untamed, and empty, save for a few overgrown paths that cut through the tall grass. My father's land was no different. An old barn-style house sat in the middle of a vast, lonely field. Only one narrow dirt path led up to it, hidden by weeds and broken shrubs. The first week was exhausting. I spent nearly every waking hour cleaning and unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. One night, as I was organizing the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. I froze. The gravel crunching beneath tires was unmistakable. Slowly, I walked to the window and peeked outside. An old blue pickup truck was making its way down the narrow dirt path. It felt wrong. There was no reason for anyone to come out here so late unless they were looking for this house. The truck stopped just short of the front yard. I could barely make out a man sitting behind the wheel, but the shadows and darkness obscured his features. He lingered there for a few moments, headlights cutting across the field, before backing up and driving away. I told myself it was probably just someone lost, entering the wrong address. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crawled up my spine. A few days passed, and I finally finished cleaning the house. Sunday night came, and I was sitting on the couch eating a simple dinner while watching TV. The quiet was comforting, almost peaceful, until I heard it again, the distant crunch of tires on gravel. my stomach dropped. I muted the TV and held my breath. The same pickup truck was approaching, only this time its headlights were off. Panic set in immediately. I checked my phone. It was 12:50 a.m. The thought that someone could drive all this way in the dead of night sent chills down my spine. The truck stopped directly in front of the house. A man stepped out and started walking toward the porch. I froze. There was no knock, no doorbell, nothing, just him approaching. I crept to the front door and looked through the peephole. He stood there, staring at the door, his posture rigid, almost deliberate. There was something about the way he paused, as if considering his next move, that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Then, almost casually, he turned, walked back to his truck, got in, and drove off. I called the police immediately. They took a report, but there was nothing else they could do. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me jump. I kept imagining him standing outside, waiting, watching, just like he had the first night. I woke the next morning to a single knock at the front door. One knock, my heart stopped. I rushed to the window. No truck, no man, nothing. I tiptoed toward the stairs, desperate to investigate, but then I noticed the front door, slightly open. I froze. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway below. I ducked into the spare bedroom and whispered into my phone to 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line as the intruder slowly ascended the stairs. The footsteps led directly to the main bedroom. I could hear drawers being opened, furniture moving, the unmistakable sound of someone searching for something. I stayed silent, afraid that even a whisper could give me away. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Eventually, the footsteps returned downstairs and the front door creaked shut behind him. I ran to the back window, desperate for any glimpse of the man. In the faint light of the moon, I saw him moving across the backyard, walking into the tall grass of the field behind the house until he disappeared entirely. When the police arrived, they combed the area but found nothing. My description of the man was all they had to work with. I had no idea what he had been looking for, but the thought that he might have known something about my father, something hidden in the house, made my stomach churn. The scariest part, he must have known I was home, yet he didn't care. He went through the house anyway. What would he have done if I hadn't hidden in the spare bedroom? A month later, I sold the house. I couldn't stay there, couldn't live with the thought that someone might come back for me, or worse, for whatever they thought they could find. Even now, years later, I still check online every few months for any reports of break-ins at that address. There haven't been any, but I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of knowing someone had come so close and yet left without warning. Even today, I sometimes imagine him moving silently through the tall grass behind the house, searching for something that perhaps only he knew existed. And I shiver because I know that if he comes back, I may not be so lucky next time.